Was price fixing the cause of the recent egg price hike? Should we tax all non-MAGA billionaires? And if airlines are offering inflated wages and unsustainable losses, is that waste and inefficiency or a public good? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet, find the most interesting takes, and we critique them or praise them, show where they go right or wrong. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. Before we get started, make sure to give us a follow on socials. You can find us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Leave us a like and a comment as well. If you're enjoying, send us takes. We like to critique what you guys send in as well. Without further ado, we'll get into the meat of it. First take comes from an individual named Tristan Snell, and he tweets, this is from earlier this week, I believe, or maybe last week. Today, egg producers liable for price fixing scheme per new verdict by federal jury. The top two egg producers, Cal-Maine and Rose Acre, and two top industry groups were raising and fixing egg prices. Case now moves to a damages phase. Yes, inflation was partly price gouging. Now, of course, this was the tweet that I actually originally saw, and then community notes came in on Twitter and filled in the context, which I think will clue you in on our opinion on this take. The community notes read, the price fixing happened between 2004 and 2008. The lawsuit was filed in 2011. All right, what is your make of the tweet?
So I don't like, obviously that community note's great because it provides a little bit more context as to whether, you know, whether this relates specifically to the inflation we're feeling right now. And I don't know much about, Cal-Maine and Rose Acre and any of that stuff, but I do know that true monopolies where price gouging and price fixing and all this stuff goes on, those only occur when there is some element of force that is unilaterally imposed upon everyone that denies the ability of that either one denies the ability of new market entrants where they can provide better service at a better price, or two, where they force everyone that is in there to not be able to they force a price floor basically through whether it's through regulatory statutes or through some sort of antitrust law or things like that. The natural flow of a market, let's say that, and I think we spoke on this before, but like if you've got a true monopoly, in order for a true monopoly in a market that doesn't have unilateral force imposed on it by some government actor, if you have a true monopoly, that person has to continue providing the best service at the best price in order to maintain that monopoly. And in that case, that's deflationary. Everyone wins. That means people are getting better products at lower prices, so they have to spend less money. Their dollar actually goes further. When there is a unilateral force, though, like that doesn't occur. Like you no longer have people that are trying to compete. And so if you've got a monopoly like that, chances are that they're going to try and raise prices. And that's what everyone's scared of, is that, someone gets a monopoly, they keep prices low, and then after they kill all the competition, they raise their prices and now they price gouge. Well, just because they killed all the current competition doesn't mean that there's not going to be new competition coming in. Like, it's not like there's going to be other people that don't have the idea to produce eggs. At some point in history, people have been producing eggs and using chickens and farming chickens for forever. Someone's going to figure it out and be like, hey, like this company is making it really, really expensive for everyone. Like maybe I could come in and provide it at a cheaper cost. And then what's going to happen if they want to maintain that monopoly? The bad company's going to have to lower their prices again and provide a better service again. And so either way, the consumer wins, right? Like they get a better product at a better price. And maybe the monopoly maintains itself and is able to outlast it. And there's a little bit of an ebb and flow of the prices, but overall the consumer is better off. This is not the same as government inflation, where there is more and more money chasing less and less goods being made. I mean, that is really like, even if you wanted to grant that there are some percentage of companies that are doing price gouging in a true free market form without any help from the government, even if we grant that premise, it's responsible for the tiniest, most insignificant amount of like effect on the inflationary burdens that Americans are feeling right now. And as much as so that's like, I would trade all of the inflation that we're experiencing from money printing for that inflation in a heartbeat. And I think everyone would be better off.
100%. So I originally had found this through someone breaking down this tweet again before the community notes. And this guy went into detail. He goes into the article, he goes into the sources, and he goes into all of the data and all of the history. And of course, before the community note, the way that this tweet reads is very much implying that the inflation that the price gouging is referring to is modern inflation. Like, about, I don't know, was it maybe 6 months ago when eggs became like $5 a carton for no reason, right? That's clearly what this tweet is implying, and that is clearly not what the actual lawsuit is about. And when you go back and look at the data of how much price gouging, how much the price was inflated, I believe this was about maybe inflating it to $2.50 to $3 or something. Not $2 to $3 more, like the price of eggs inflated to the price of $2 or $3. And then you look at the inflation that occurred, that we would be, that would be top of mind for us recently, and that was a much, much higher rate of inflation. I don't remember the exact amount, but it's like $4 or something like that. So the implication here is that, this massive amount of inflation we experienced, it's not inflation from bad policies or the Biden administration or printing money or COVID or anything like that. It's because of these evil businesses that are colluding together. And like you said, even if that was so much of a, the reason why price increased, let's take that inflation instead of the inflation we're actually experiencing, and our egg cartons would not have gone up to $5. It would have gone up to, again, like $3 or something, which would be great. And the other thing that, you kind of dove into the heart of the antitrust monopoly thing. And the other thing I'd add in particular when it comes to agriculture, is that there's so many people who in the ag world, it's almost a microcosm of what is true, just generally speaking, but how legislators and lawmakers and bureaucrats and regulators do all of this stuff on that industry without actually living in that scenario, without having any idea of how these businesses operate, how farms work, how the agriculture industry exists. And so you end up with all of these regulations that drive up costs on farms. What does that do? Well, it forces consolidation of farms because of artificial costs. So you get fewer family-run, smaller farms, and you get more mega conglomerates. You know what more mega conglomerates would hypothetically lead to? It would lead to monopolization or price fixing through two big leaders, who control all of the supply of eggs, talking to each other. So even in the scenario that I think you accurately take down as very unlikely in a true free market, but even if that's the case, the very policies that people on the left support, things like restricting minimum pen requirement sizes so that, like, you have to have certain amounts of space for animals. I don't believe in treating animals cruelly, but I don't think the government gets to define what cruel or is and isn't for an animal. And so when you have to retrofit all of these pens, you have to, and like California did in their Proposition 12, and then they say that no meat can be sold in California, even if it's from out of state, unless they abide by these regulations. And then, the way that people ship meat or eggs, it's usually pretty global. So now all the shippers are basically saying, well, you have to operate within California's rules or else we're not going to take your meat. That means then that the smaller farms either have to pay super high prices and retrofit, or they're just going to close down and sell to bigger conglomerates. You consolidate, and again, you create the field that is more ripe for monopolization practices that you're so worried about because of all these other regulatory policies and all these rules that you're putting in. So if you really want antitrust policy, if you're really worried about monopolization, the better method is to get your hands out and deregulate and let small farms exist.
Yeah. Isn't that funny that, like, the government will literally pay, like, it's a investment strategy to purchase acres and acres and acres of farmland and not farm it and collect subsidy for not farming it. The government will literally pay farmers to not plant crops and to not harvest them. And the goal is to support farmers that do grow crops so that they can sell it at an inflationary price, right? So, like, that if you want to, like, talk about actual inflationary mechanisms of monopolies, like, that's an actual one, and it's facilitated by the government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, we'll move to our next take here. And the tweet is the author is relevant here, just reporting that Steve Bannon says he favors a quote massive tax increase on billionaires end quote because none of them are MAGA. All right, what do you think of that sentiment?
What a terrible take. I mean, it kind of reminds me. There's this meme going around of like it's got kind of the the NPC that's like perfectly fine, like perfectly grumpy. Actually, is the first one. It's kind of inverted. Grumpy at like we need to eat the rich. I hate that Jeff Bezos made X amount of $1 billion this past year, and then there's a NPC that's super happy that Taylor Swift suddenly became a billionaire this year. And that's what this is. It's just like, I'm happy when my side does good and I'm happy when the other side does bad. And none of that is based in principle. And you and I both dislike people that hold those views for the reason that it's like, there's no principle that's actually applied. There's no actual bettering of the world. It's literally a distributive game where for me to win, you have to lose. And that's the type of game that Steve Bannon is playing right here. He just really, like, he literally says it. None of them are MAGA. None of them are on my team. So I'm okay if they get massive tax increases. And in one way, I don't agree with him on the tax increases, but I agree with him on his disdain for the billionaire class, which a lot of them are enriched through the mechanisms and levers of the government. They take advantage of them, like we were just talking about. And the other one, with the other take, like they impose the monopolies with the help of the federal police and army and all these different things at threat of that, basically, and legislation and being able to use those types of mechanisms to enforce their will upon people. But just because I don't like them doesn't mean my principle is different. And, you and I were talking about like Marvel earlier, but like one of the silver linings of Marvel that came out, Captain America having the principle of like, we don't trade lies. We don't trade our principles. Like we do what is right, regardless of what the cost is. And if that means someone that we don't like, lives in freedom, like, great. Like, we are advancing liberty and advancing freedom, which is good. We still need to win, and we're not going to, back down from it. But if you don't have your principles, then you have nothing. And apparently Steve Bannon doesn't have any principles, so therefore he has nothing.
Yeah. Well, this is just, I don't know. It's funny because to say that the uniparty exists or that Republicans and Democrats are just the same, on one hand, it feels very archaic to think this way after 2016. And yet the post 2016 Republican Party, even though it is fundamentally different and they are different entities, they really are just the same thing at the end of the day, in certain ways, at least in certain perspectives. It's this tension you have to hold because you can't treat them the exact same. They don't operate the same way, but it is all this will to power. It's long overdue, but I'm reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time. I've watched them, but I haven't actually read. And obviously this is a theme throughout, but I was struck just right away when Gandalf is talking to Frodo about and recounting to him of how Bilbo took the ring from Smeagol and all that. And Frodo, says something akin to, "Oh, I wish that Bilbo had just killed Smeagol then and there, because he's such a horrible, horrible thing." And Gandalf says, like, well, it's the very reason why he was able to resist the ring for so long is because he didn't, right?
Yeah.
Because he had that in him. That's the only reason why he could even last as long as he did and give up the ring willingly with a temptation. And again, that theme, goes throughout. But it's one of those things where, if you have power and you have these reins of government, if you're not using them to destroy itself, then you are going to become weak you are going to do the thing where you're like, oh, I wish he'd just tax those billionaires who aren't MAGA. And then you become the billionaires who aren't MAGA in a sense. You're just the inverse coin of it. It just becomes a game of when are you going to start prosecuting, the leftists who, I don't know, like protest in front of your businesses because they're trespassing in a way that you don't like, rather than a peaceful assembly of protest. Not that every leftist protest has been peaceful, but mind, just as an example. So all of this to say, I think this is a bad perspective to have, and it really is just funny because it's another way of how transparent and opaque politics is. The war party will always exist. Whoever wants to be pro-war will find the current reason to be pro-war. And in the same way, whoever wants to be big government or big taxes or whatever it is, they will find whatever justification it is to do it, whenever it advances the cause. whenever, it's easy to be a small government conservative when you don't have
The
any
power.
realistic power. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then once you get the power, it's another thing to actually self-sacrificially, in a sense, give it up.
Yeah, I mean, Bannon literally is Frodo at the end of the books, being
Yeah.
like, "The ring is mine." Like that's like if he ever got into power, I mean, he's explicitly telling us right now he would use that power to do what they have done to conservatives. And I mean, I'm not surprised, but I'm still disappointed.
I, the other thing that's funny is I watched I don't know if you've seen, Andrew Heaton has a new show, and the first episode of that, he has Michael Malice on, and they're talking about the different about Michael Malice's book, The White Pill, and they're talking about how Andrew Heaton comments like, I really appreciated your approach to talking about communism and how it's just an immoral system, because I usually take the approach that it's just unworkable and unfeasible, and Michael says, well, I take my approach because I just think yours doesn't work. You explain to people why a centrally planned economy won't run properly, and they say, okay, I don't care, get against the wall. And to me, this is kind of the reverse of that, where it's like you can explain to people like, no, tax increases on the billionaires is a disincentive for people to work hard culturally. It ends up in bad hands, because billionaires, even though not all of them are great in our current system, ideally they're the ones who are the most responsible with money and invest it better than taxes would do. And all. You can say all that, and Steve Bannon says, okay, don't care, they're not MAGA, give us the billionaire tax.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where few people are rational enough to prioritize an argument that makes sense. There's that Blaise Pascal quote, something along the lines of like, most men don't believe or don't believe because of reason, but they believe because what they want to feel, or something like that. And that's just how this comes across too, where it's like,
yeah,
you railed against big government for so long, and now you're just saying, let's create another arm of big government because I want it. That's where it boils down to. Okay, our next take.
We'll do the Sweet Polly one.
Yeah. Okay. So I assume it's a reply to the first. Yep. So there's the first take here for context, and then there's a reply. So the first take reads: Javier Milei's attempt to privatize the state-owned Aerolíneas Argentinas, which is the Argentinian airlines, I would imagine. Socialists: we want employee ownership of the means of production. Milei: okay, the employees can own Aerolíneas. Socialists: our union doesn't agree to that, since we'd go bankrupt without government assistance. Socialists are reluctant to make it privately owned because they've been receiving inflated wages with a company that's been running at a loss for years, and these wages can only be upheld through taxpayer extortion. That's an example of all waste and inefficiency within the public sector. And then there's a reply. It says, it's not, quote, waste and inefficiency, is what he means, end quote, if the airline provides a public good. Being able to operate at a loss when necessary is a huge advantage, and state-run airlines are typically far superior to the private profit-driven version, as any American who's traveled abroad well knows. All right. What's your take?
Oh, well, I mean, if we just strip all the context around it away and just operate off of pure business waste and efficiency, like what it actually means, it's like, I don't think you can get away from the fact that if you have someone that does not operate at a profit and operates with inflated wages, that there is waste and inefficiency just endemic within any organization that has those qualities about it. I mean, that's just like, it's like foundational to understanding what is going wrong with something. And I saw this other take a while back about how, like, name a government sponsored program or service, quote unquote, that can exist without making someone else's life immediately worse to make someone else's, hypothetically better. And no one can name it, right? Like, no one can name it. So this thought of like, oh, a public good, it's like, it's not a public good if you have to make someone else's life worse in order to offer that public good. The only ethical, the only principle-based way to have any sort of exchange is when both people make an exchange and they both do it voluntarily. And yeah, sure, maybe there's some like buyer's regret and stuff. But in the moment when they make that exchange, they're doing it because they have all the forces at their back saying, this is the best thing that I can do right now. When it comes to the government, it's pay up, and we're going to allocate where your funds are, regardless of what you think should be done or should not be done. And if you don't pay up, like, we're going to come to your door and arrest you and throw you in a cage for the rest of your life. So there is no such thing as a public good, because it's not like there's a universal, like, everyone benefits from this. Someone's life, and in most cases, a lot of people's lives are made worse in order to offer that public good. And then this guy's point about being able to operate at a loss when necessary is a huge advantage. I agree with him on that. Like, airlines and any company that operates and has a strong correlation to the ups and downs of an economy and travel and deal in luxury goods and things like that, which up until recently, travel used to be fairly luxurious. Like, you had to figure out how to weather the storm. And the way that you would do that is you would put away money and save it, so that when there did come a really hard time, you had money to spend, and you could even potentially make gains by purchasing up people's assets, or not people's, but companies' assets from companies that were not as responsible as you are and that went under. And I remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I had a guy telling me, because we were kind of discussing the subsidies for the airlines, and he's like, well, if you don't fund the airlines, like, there won't be any airlines. It's essential. It's like, dude, if an airline goes under, it's not like the fleet of 2,000 747s that they got just disappears. It's like, those still exist, and some good actor that was smart about it and didn't do stock buybacks and then didn't do certain bonuses and acted in a responsible manner is going to purchase those and is going to continue to offer better and better services and scale up. That's the benefit of a free market solution, is that actors that are good and responsible are rewarded, and actors that are bad and produce waste and inefficiency are eliminated.
Yeah, I somewhat cringe at my own analogy that I'm going to use here, because I think it's somewhat reductivist, but it is helpful in some contexts, I think, to think about spending and macroeconomics on the scale of, like, an individual household or budget or something. And it's like, okay, think about, like, spending on a credit card. If you are saying, like, oh, look, I can get this car that, let's say you've got, like, a family of 5, and this new car that I want to buy can fit all 5 of us in here, and I can't make the payments every month without using my credit card and putting some of it on credit. But it's a public good because I can transport all my family for it. And so really, that should just go on infinitely. I should just be able to continue to use this credit card over and over. Obviously, that's not sustainable, because you will run out of money.
Yep.
And what you realize you need to do is you need to get to a place where you can afford, you need to choose something to scale back. So even if the nice luxury car that you want that fits all of your family in it seems like it is that public good, you also have to recognize that in order for it to actually be a feasible, realistic good that is achievable, is you have to scale back and find something to make it affordable. In the same way that if you actively, eat all of the fruit before you harvest any of the seeds, like, you don't have anything sustainable. It was like, oh, great, you ate all the fruit, but now we don't have anything for the future. The economy is in a place where the government tries to accelerate spending and accelerate these subsidies beyond what we have realistically to sustain itself. A business recognizes that there are certain times when you can make an expenditure with resources you don't currently have through, like, a loan. And the reason why they have to make those calculated is because they say, by spending all of this upfront now, I will make this back and more, and I will produce more in the economy. And so that, the good I am producing will be sustainable. The government doesn't have that. The government has the Federal Reserve, which just prints money infinitely for them to be able to afford things, which ends up costing all of us. And so that's one of the key differences between, like, a government subsidized and run airline industry is, like, when you have a government that is willing to just make these expenditures and sink money in to a system that is not sustainable, they don't have the same level of incentive to say, by sinking this money in now, we're going to be able to make it sustainable in the future. People don't think about it in that way. They just think, oh, well, the government just will forever pay this in and will forever get the public good, and that's that. But really, the best solution is when you can create a self-sustaining and self-profitable system. The idea that you have a system that doesn't help sustain itself is not a great system. And that's why you need like specific institutions that are supposed to do charitable goods, and that's why like private charities are good for things that are not sustainable in and of themselves to provide those resources. But even then, charities are an institution that are proven to be great with resource management and allocation compared to the government, who's absolutely terrible at it and inefficient. So, it's like even in the scenario where you want something that can provide a public good, you want that directed by individuals who are responsible and accountable, like charities are, because they're accountable and responsible to donors who want to see like, hey, my money's actually being used for something, rather than just being taken by force where there's no accountability. It's not like I can say, hey, government, you didn't spend my money efficiently enough on this public good. I don't want to pay you taxes. That's not how it works. So they don't have any incentive to be efficient and to create sustaining goals, or even to spend non-sustainable goals in a realistic and measured way.
Yeah, there's also this like his last point about, and I don't really know much about this, but state-run airlines are typically far superior to any private for-profit airlines, as any American who's traveled abroad well knows. Like I've traveled abroad a lot, and I don't know that, but there's this like fallacy that like, oh, if a state-run airline is operating with the same type of constraints and same type of advantage as a profit-driven airline, and the existence of a state-funded airline doesn't affect a private or profit-driven airline. And it's like, yeah, like if you are operating, if you are a business and there's like if you're setting up a pizza shop and you've got your pizza shop, it's totally profit-driven. You do everything yourself. You source your ingredients, all this stuff, and then there's a government-run pizza shop right next to you, and they get all of their dough subsidized by all of the taxpayers in your town. It's like, yeah, you're going to be forced to do certain things differently. It's going to create different types of incentives, and it's going to create different types of constraints as to how you can operate. And in spite of the government interference, like just because a state-run airline, existing is government interference in a profit-driven airline or any sort of profit-driven business. Like it affects how they can actually do things and the quality of goods they can offer, because a profit-driven business has to operate within reality. It has to make money at the end of the day or it doesn't exist. A state-run one doesn't have to. They have the advantage of not caring about whether they make a profit or not, or whether they operate at a loss or not. And because of that, like, that affects everyone else in the market, and it creates these imbalances that make services not offered in the best way they possibly can, because you basically said, hey, everyone in my town or in my country or whatever has to give money, has to be a customer. Maybe that's how it should be put. Everyone in the country has to be a customer of that airline, regardless of whatever they choose to do. And they might have to they might choose to go with the private airline, but already portion of their check they could have spent with that private airline is already being spent on the state-run one. So these people will be like, oh yeah, a state-run one is superior. Well, it's like, yeah, they operate at a massive advantage because they force everyone to be a customer of them. Whereas the private one has to convince them with services, and they have to convince them after you've already taken money from them. Oh, you're muted, Donnie.
Sorry about that. No, I think you're absolutely right. I don't have any more to add, so we'll move on to the next. All right. This one comes from Karen Ann Harlos, who's part of the Libertarian Party. She tweets, I love that non-anarchists give allegiance to self-defense rights, but they can't do so consistently. I'll take it, but it is what it is. If the state can justly monopolize rights protection, a part of self-defense, without affirmative consent of everyone thus protected, it is not a right. It is at best a quote unquote right.
With
all
an
right,
asterisk.
What do you? Yeah, exactly. Asterisk. Yeah. What do you make of this take here?
This is a good take, and I mean, it highlights, I think, our overall view of the government and that, like, and rights and all this stuff. Like I was listening to Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan podcast talk about. He's like, yeah, the founding fathers just said, like, it's self-evident that we have the right to exist and be free. And like they did that, and then they formed their government and everything. But like, I think that is a mantra that every individual should have. That's like, hey, it's self-evident that I have the right to defend myself. And regardless of whether the government says I have that right or not, I do have that right, and I will protect it. And maybe it's you have that right in as much as you are able to protect that. And so it makes it even more insidious when you look at the government with, Second Amendment stuff or freedom of speech or anything. Freedom of speech, which is the ability to defend an idea. And the Second Amendment, the ability to defend your person and property, when they try and take those away or limit those, it's like, oh yeah, like they do think that they are God. We think and we believe that we have those as naturally imbued rights, regardless of whether it's from God or just because of reality. But you can see kind of just how insidious the government is in coming around and thinking like, oh yeah, like we actually have the control of that. And Carrie Ann Harless does a good job highlighting that conservatives like have this belief in a higher power in principle, but they also believe that like, oh, we need to all vote on it. And it's like, well, then what you're really doing is assigning that like people voting on something is actually more of a right. The voice of the majority is more of a right than the actual right of the individual, and that's the great fallacy of people that believe in democracy.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the interesting things about the conservative in particular position on gun rights is that they somehow think that gun rights are absolute, and then they're not absolute. Like, it depends on who they're talking to. It's like the moment someone reaches for their guns, they're like clutching them. But if they perceive someone who's kind of on their side saying like, well, but we don't need this or that, they usually kind of like, well, oh, okay. And it goes to show that I think, unfortunately, a lot of the self-rights or self-defense rights movement is more cultural than it is as principled in the philosophy. Now, I want to say that with a grain of salt, because there's so many great Second Amendment people who are well versed in the philosophy of it, who do stand for it because it's for self-defense, not for like hunting or whatever. And I think it might just be a little bit of cognitive dissonance that lives in their head when they're an absolutist on the Second Amendment, but then also support things like the police as an institution, and like, well, we need that. It's like, okay, so you don't believe in self-defense entirely because the state has somewhat of a say in what counts as self-defense. But I think there is this strain of sort of cultural Second Amendmentism, where people aren't as rigidly up to date in the philosophy of it. They just want it, again, because it's seen as the independent thing, but they don't necessarily believe in the independence. They might say they do, but they haven't thought through it all or whatever. And that's to some degree what I would argue is the difference between some conservatives and why they aren't libertarian yet, is they just haven't sat down and thought about some of the principles that they hold. If I really am a Second Amendment person and I do believe in the right to self-defense, then I should really be questioning any authority or institution that tells me that I can't have that gun and I don't have the right to self-defense, because that's a government that can disarm you is intrinsically hostile to your ability for self-defense, and that's just the fact of the matter. If there is something that can disarm you, that thing has more authority than whatever thing it can disarm from you. If you're ceding that they have the right to take away your ability for self-defense, then you think that your right to self-defense is not as strong as whatever this external authority's right is to do that. And so, if there are certain scenarios where I think that's the case, like for instance, I think a parent's right to disarm a kid from, like holding a bat, wailing on people, I think that is, the parents have a bigger right to disarm the kid than the kid has to their self-defense, because the parent has an intrinsic responsibility to defend that child, right? I don't think that's the same with the government. And I think that sort of parental government thinking is what a lot of, again, conservatives or Second Amendment people say they decry, but if they do affirm in some of these small ways, and I think she points that out pretty eloquently.
Yeah, it's good. I don't really have much more to add to it other than like conservatives, when they take this point, it's like, well, I'm all for gun rights as long as we keep it the right way. It's like, well, it's kind of baseline, for us to be able to protect ourselves. You wouldn't say that about anything else, but it, like you're saying, it just highlights that there is a democracy that is at the top of everything, and that is truly what matters. But then when you actually put forth the realities of democracy, which is 51% telling the other 49% what to do, people don't like it. But generally people don't think through that conclusion. And we've been told through Star Wars and lots of other things that democracy is good. It's actually not.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Our last take for the episode comes from Mark E. Elias, or Elias. I apologize for not knowing your name pronunciation there. He tweets, "Let's be clear. A vote for no labels is a vote for Trump. A vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Trump. A vote for Cornel West is a vote for Trump. A vote for Robert Kennedy is a vote for Trump. Not voting is a vote for Trump. A vote for Biden and Democrats is a vote for democracy.
Oh, democracy.
Which is a really good tie into your last remark there. So what do you think, Britt? What would you say about this take? And by the way, if you criticize this take, that's a vote for Trump.
Yeah, exactly. And you could flip it around, right? Like a vote for the Libertarian candidate is a vote for Joe Biden, and the same. Spin it around, and there's the same version for the Republicans, and people like Ben Shapiro will spin that. You know, I'm kind of crazy, but I think a vote for, let's say, if I voted for Gary Johnson in 2016. A little bit of regret there, but also didn't really like either the other folks. So that was, to me, the best choice. And I was like, well, at least my vote could potentially help get. Well, maybe I should say it this way: I voted for Gary Johnson. My vote was not for Trump, and it was not for Hillary Clinton. It was for Gary Johnson, because I wouldn't have voted for Trump or for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the goal of my vote was to try and get the Libertarian Party to 5%, because I thought there was an actual shot of that. If we get to 5%, it opens up a lot of doors on the debate stage and major party status and all these different types of things. So that was what my vote was for. And the fallacy that occurs with this type of logic, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is that, like, there are people that would have voted for Trump, but they instead voted that would have voted for Joe Biden, but instead voted for Jill Stein. It's like, no, those people probably would have never voted for Biden. Like, there's no way that you could know that they would have voted Biden. They chose to vote for Jill Stein. And so, like, if we really want the cascade of ideas, and you really want someone, if democracy is supposed to work the way it's supposed to, Biden and the Democrats have to convince the Jill Stein voter that they are more in line than Jill Stein is for them to vote for them. That's like the whole point of this exercise, is for people to make their case and then the public to decide. And if you can't persuade the public, then you don't deserve their vote, and they weren't going to vote for you in the first place.
I was just going to say, it sounds very democratic, telling people that if you don't vote for this one person, then you are not voting for democracy. Yeah. That's an absurd thing to say.
Yeah.
It's the same brain rot that exists in people who say, we have to support Ukraine. They're the only functional democracy. Oh yeah, the only functional democracy that banned all opposition parties, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument here, that democracy is an unblemished good, and it is the end all be all. This is an anti-democratic tweet. You are telling someone that if they do not make the choice you want them to make, you're saying there is one correct choice here, and if they don't make that choice, then they are in fact voting. Basically, they're doing evil or doing harm, is what they're saying. That's not democracy. Democracy is everyone gets to make up their own mind, and everyone gets to vote and express what their preference is. And again, whether that ends up with 51% ruling over the 49% or not, the issue, the entire premise of democracy is that every individual person gets to at least make their voice known. The most admirable aspect of democracy, in my opinion, is the idea that individuals get to at least make an expression that is their own. And that it's one of the reasons why I don't know if in the long run it would be more or less liberty leaning to have, a parliamentary system or not, but at the very least, the one thing that in principle or in theory I can admire about the way that the ballots work in most of our states, not in Washington, but in most states, at least for the general we do in the primary, is that you get to choose, you get to express who you want to vote for and who you support, and you're not tied to anything else. It's not like you're in the UK where you vote for the Conservative Party and you have to vote for your member in order for them to elect the prime minister. You get to choose. I like this guy for governor, and I don't like this guy for state representative, even though they're the same party. I'm going to vote for this person here, and I'm going to vote for this policy, which seems contradictory here. You as an individual get to express your opinion. Now, again, the more full interpretation of that is just letting people live that way, right? Live with those things. But at the very least, the admirable aspect of democracy, again, ideally, is that ideally in an idyllic world, is that you get to at least express those things and that you get to make those individual voices heard. So if your entire complaint is that the only way to preserve and vote for democracy is by not engaging in democracy, then we're just back full circle at the whole, like, you have to use the power that you want to destroy argument. The whole,
Yes.
we have to use the government to destroy our enemies or else they're going to use it to destroy us. It's just the exact argument on the flip side to say the only way to preserve democracy is to destroy it.
Did you ever watch No Country for Old Men?
No.
Okay. All right. There's you should. And then two, there's this great scene, and it's I'm not saying I agree with the villain's worldview, but he makes a very strong point. And he's talking to this guy that he's about to kill, and he's like, "Hey, you've lived your life with this principle, and if that principle got you to this point, like, what was the point of that principle?" And I would say to the Democrats and the Republicans, they're like, "You got to vote for us in order to protect democracy," or maybe they're saying like, "Well, having two parties is just a natural function of how our government is, and this is a good thing." It's like, well, what's the point of democracy if it leads us to where 51% of people can vote to kill the other 49%? I mean, I know that's like kind of reductionist and a bit absurd, but like, if you take it to its inevitable conclusion, that's what it can be. You have 51% enforcing their will upon the other 49%. And if that is where it can go, then what's the point of democracy in the first place? The only parts
jump in. The only reason why that wouldn't work in our system is because of an undemocratic system set up by a few people who chose for a framework that disallowed a majority to do that. So the only reason why that literally isn't possible is because of an undemocratic process.
Yes, but the same people who are saying that we need to protect democracy are advocating to do away with any of the few checks and balances we do have to prevent the worst parts of democracy coming forth.
Exactly.
And so it's like, what's the point of democracy if it got us to this point? Everyone would say we don't really like how things are run. We think it's a bit ridiculous. It doesn't represent our own interest. Everyone has this sense that, like, the representatives that we democratically elect, we have like a 16% approval rating for them. So it's like proof that it doesn't work. And so this system of democracy got us to this point. So therefore, what's the point of it? It's not actually a good form of governments. And like you were saying, like, let's just let people make their decisions for themselves. That's the part that we hypothetically like about democracy. But for some reason, we won't let we won't let it live in its most pure form and be expressed in its most pure form.
Right. And a lot of the argumentation for that would be, well, because the things that we want to vote on are out of our control, like making other people pay for things that we want paid for. And then you think, so again, what it comes down to is forcing your will on others.
Yes.
Got it. So the things that you can live out and you want to do, you can. But the things that you need to vote for are your impositions of will by force on other people, whether that's through things like a tax that causes gas prices to raise because you want the greedy oil companies to pay, or whatever, or whether it's preventing someone else from owning a mechanism of self-defense because you don't want them to own that. There's all kinds of ways you can impose your will on other people, and the only way you get to do that is if you can convince a majority of other people to rob the minority of their rights. Or at least not even necessarily the minority of voting members of their rights. Because that's, of course, the other ridiculous aspect is how little voter participation we actually get. And yet those rules all come into play. Somehow these representatives that don't even get a majority of people in their states voting one way for or against them get to rule over all of them. It's kind of a weird thing when you think about it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's the episode for this time. Thanks so much for being with us. As a reminder, give us a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Share it with your friends. We appreciate it a ton. Send us your takes, whether you think we're right or wrong. Let us know in the comments, and we will catch you on the next one. Take care.